Welcome to MindTricks Radio, where we'll explore contemporary topics in psychology through interviewing creative and innovative thinkers in the field. I'm your host, Dr. Aaron Kaplan. Thanks for tuning in. We're here today with Parul Somani, an MIT and Harvard Business School graduate and author of her debut book, The Path of Least Regret. Weeks after giving birth to her second child, Parul was diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer, and from the tribulation she faced, she went on to develop the Path of Least Regret framework, transforming regret from a backward-looking burden into a compass for intentional decision-making. Today, Parul speaks globally on decision-making, mindset, resilience, and intentional living, helping Fortune 100 leaders and high achievers move forward with clarity and confidence. Parul, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Aaron. Looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. I really enjoyed your book, The Path of Least Regret. I found it to be a very moving and insightful book, and I'm really interested in digging in and learning all about that in greater detail and talking with you about it. Before we get started with that, though, I always like to spend some time getting to know my guests a little bit more. And I know you talk quite a bit about your bio and your history in your book, but it's so moving. I want to talk a little bit more about that. So let's just start off by telling us a little bit more about yourself and ultimately what moved you to follow this path and journey along that led you to the book, The Path of Least Regret.
Absolutely. I was born in India and had a very traditional immigrant upbringing in the States, grew up here, and saw my parents working really hard to provide my sister and I with a better education. And I think through osmosis, a lot of that element of resilience in terms of approaching it with grit and just working hard to do what you need to do was something that I observed through my upbringing. And that led me on a career path where it was just a matter of like working hard and doing your best. And so the next step was always very clear. It's like, you study well in high school, try to get into a great college, study hard in college, get the prestigious internship. And I ended up on this corporate career path where I joined a top tier management consulting firm out of college, and then went to business school and just tried to continue rising up the ranks. And through that process, never really had to question like what the next thing is. It just felt like it was very clear, and having a blueprint for decision making or for navigating uncertainty was something I just never really needed or had to think about too actively. And then there were a few inflection points that made me realize that any approach to decision making I had weren't necessarily going to continue to work for me. One of those was hitting burnout after a very long career in management consulting and realizing that professionally, I don't actually know what I might want to do next. And the second, which was much more impactful in terms of its emotional impact, was being diagnosed with breast cancer the same week my second daughter was born by a C-section.
Yeah.
And facing the uncertainty of that time period, facing all of the hard choices that come with battling a situation where there is no guaranteed outcome and where there is such deep levels of emotional roller coaster involved, led me to realize that I need a new lens for how to think about navigating this chapter of my life and ultimately what turned out to be a decision-making lens for many decisions that would come later on in life as well.
Yeah, I really like that about your book, about sort of examining the whole decision-making process and how there's a lot of ways people can go about doing that. And oftentimes people are not being very conscious about the way they're going about making decisions. So it sounds like this crisis occurred, this very intense period of life for you, and then you really re-examine how you go about making decisions in the first place. And frankly, as therapists, we do that a lot with our patients. That is a big part of what we do. People come in with crises or they're approaching a problem or an issue in their life in a particular way and having a hard time figuring out the best way to go about looking at it. And so you provide some interesting insights into that. I love the fact that you're from India, by the way. People who know me know that I spent a few years in Nepal, and that place is close to my heart a lot. So I've been to India a few times
Oh,
traveling,
wonderful.
and that's really cool. Where in India were you born?
Yeah, so I was born in northern India in the state of Rajasthan,
Okay.
and literally a small village in Rajasthan. So, when you think about decision making, I often think also about how some of the most impactful decisions in our life might actually be made by someone else. And the decision that my parents made to leave India to, bring me to the States itself put me on an entire path that I might not have ever been on. But over the years, I've spent a lot of time in India as well, still have a lot of extended family there. So grew up visiting, I've taken my daughters back. And I actually also spent some time professionally working in India also.
Well, fascinating. And you're right. It's sort of like for a lot of people where they end up, it's kind of like you think of this idea of like parallel universes, right? Like what had happened if you had stayed in India, your life would have been different in so many ways, but you came to the US and then went on a different path. And it's sort of interesting to contemplate like the possibilities of what could have happened if things happened differently. I'm always fascinated with that kind of concept of how life trajectories sort of pan out. And oftentimes it's never the way you might expect them to.
Absolutely. It's like the movie, the sliding doors, and that reference of if you catch the train or you don't, and what
Yeah,
happens with the outcome of your life.
yeah. Well, let's start by talking a little bit about this concept of regret. And I know you have this framework of looking at the path of least regret, but just regret in and of itself, like if we can just conceptualize, at least for you, when you were writing the book and you were thinking about this idea of regret, what does that mean to you?
It's a great question because the reality is, I think for most of my upbringing and life, I wasn't actively thinking about regret at all. If someone brought it up, I would think of it as like this backward looking burden that we're trying to avoid. But through my years in school or career, I wasn't thinking about it much. And then it was in 2014 when I was diagnosed at age 31 that the struggle I was having in determining what treatment plan to pursue led me on this thought process where I realized there was no easy answer. And when I thought that there is no path of least resistance, the next question to pop into my head is what is my path of least regret? And so when I started thinking about regret, it wasn't from the context of sitting down to write a book, but from the truly hard lived experience of being at a crossroad and trying to figure out which path I want to take. And I had even blogged my entire cancer journey real time back then. And the title of the blog post where I write about how I chose my treatment plan, I titled The Path of Least Regret.
Hmm.
And what that question, what is my path of least regret in that context, illuminated for me is that it started to help me think about and unpack what regret can I actually live with? And what does that mean in terms of what I value, what I'm solving for? And if I were to work backward from there, which treatment plan option would give me the most peace of mind? And not based on any guaranteed outcome, but based on the clarity of the process that I'm going through. And that's the role that regret has played in my life in the years since, and is really what I'm trying to convey in the book, is that regret doesn't have to be just this backward looking burden that we, if anything, maybe learn from, but that it can also be this forward looking compass that can actually help us understand what it is that we most care about. And with that level of clarity, with that level of intentionality, make our choices and decisions such that we maximize our peace of mind.
Well, I really like that explanation, and it reminds me of something that I talk a lot about. I've actually had a few podcast episodes where we've discussed this. And I've looked at it in terms of this concept of hindsight bias. I don't know if that's something that you've come across in the work that you've done. But basically, when we look at hindsight bias, we're looking at people who feel guilty or badly about something that happened in the past and say all the reasons why they were wrong in doing what they did or their decision was wrong. But we try to show that the decision they made at the time made sense with the information they had available to them. And that's a hard process sometimes for people. But what I hear you saying, and I really like this, is that you're kind of saying, like, proactively take a look at your situation that's right in front of you, analyze what's going on, and you make the best decision you can under the circumstances, not knowing what the outcome is necessarily going to be. I think that's sort of what you're saying with this in a way. Am I on
Yeah,
point?
uh, no, I think that's right. With hindsight bias, the question becomes, was there actually a possibility to have made a better decision at the
Yeah.
time that it was being made? And so when we think about the scenarios in which regret might thrive the most, it's two opposite ends of the pendulum. One where a decision was rushed into without being thoughtfully thought through, and there is this opportunity to have that hindsight bias and think about, oh, if I had only done this or considered this or paused long enough to consider all the options and trade-offs. Or the other end of the pendulum, where someone is so paralyzed, in analysis paralysis or paralyzed by the indecision, that the indecision becomes its own decision. And that window of opportunity to have actually have taken action passes by. And then the hindsight bias might actually be valid, because if someone had actually just taken action when they had a chance to, they might have minimized their regret. And so the key is fostering a decision-making process, one that is intentional and involving that mindful pause, so that the right level of consideration is taken of what one cares about, what the options are that's available to them, possibly what new option could be constructed that actually best mitigates their concerns or hesitations, and will give them the most peace of mind no matter what happens down the road, because that they can then assure themselves that if they were to rewind back in time to the moment that they made the decision, that they made the best one that they could at the time.
Yeah. So you talk about these five phases of the least path of least regret framework, which I think probably touches upon some of what you were just talking about. Could you walk us through that?
Yeah, what I realized is that when it comes to decision making, it's not just about that moment when we're at the crossroad and choosing between option A or option B, but it's really about this entire emotional roller coaster that we're experiencing when we're faced with a change, faced with a hard choice, or really just navigating some period of uncertainty. And so pursuing one's path of least regret is really about, how do we navigate each of those phases of the emotional roller coaster, both before being at the crossroad, when we're ready to actually make a decision, and even afterwards, when we're moving forward from the decision or questioning it. And so what I think of that emotional journey as is beginning with even just that awareness that there is something that we feel has changed or requires a change. And the question is, how do we want to move through that? Oftentimes, especially for many high achievers, we're uncomfortable with the hard emotions and we want to just move past them, and we think about resilience as just powering through. But actually giving ourselves permission to feel in those early phases, being honest with ourselves of what are we feeling and naming those emotions, is actually an important part of the journey of then being able to unpack how it is that we might be changed from the circumstance, and how might an aligned choice down the road, what that might look like. And so being able to process these emotions, honor them, but then also not be, spiraling from them, right? And being able to distinguish between rumination versus helpful reflection and actually process what are the not just emotions that I'm feeling, but what are they telling me? What might actually be mental roadblocks that I'm having that are preventing me from moving forward in a constructive way. And then it's like once we're doing the hard work of being honest with ourselves and working to overcome our mental roadblocks, only then do we have that clarity of our values and our priorities and our North Star that is going to help us be able to make a choice at the crossroad that is ultimately going to be most aligned with who we are. And so the path of least regret and the phases as I outlined them in the book is meant to give the reader a framework and a language for thinking about this emotional journey that they're on, and an understanding of where they might be on this journey and how do they navigate each of those phases of the journey most productively to minimize their regret and maximize their peace of mind.
So you have five here. That's just awareness, processing, exploration, decision, and adaptation. When you're talking about the emotions, would that sort of fall into sort of start with in the awareness part, where you're just sort of aware that you're having feelings that feel uncomfortable for you and paying attention to them rather than dismissing them?
That's exactly right. That would be the focus of the awareness phase, where it's being aware both externally and internally, right?
Hmm.
Externally, what is it that's happening? What is the circumstance that has changed that is causing some decline in your mental well being? And then looking internally and becoming aware of how is it exactly that the circumstance is making you feel? How would you actually name that? And can you provide yourself the self compassion to honor those emotions and not view them as weakness, but actually as signals, as
Hmm.
data points of what's important to you and what is something that needs your attention? And then the second phase, the processing phase, is the one where it's more about identifying how do you take those signals and data that you're learning from that first phase of emotions to actually help you process them in a way that reveals mental roadblocks that you might be facing. Is it ego? Is it imposter syndrome? Is it guilt that's preventing you from making a choice, or making a choice that would actually best be aligned with you? And how can you reframe a narrative that might be in your mind to work towards overcoming those mental roadblocks to allow for a decision making process that's most honest?
Yeah. Well, you talk a bit about high achievers and very intelligent people, which makes sense because you graduated from MIT and Harvard Business School. So you probably had a lot within your own personal story and also people around you that fall in that category. Why do you think high achievers struggle so much with overthinking and decision paralysis? What is it about that cohort that struggles with that?
There's a few factors here. The first is that high achievers are more likely to be perfectionists and want to seek the right answer when making a decision. And the challenge with that is, what is the definition of right? Because there are rarely ever any guaranteed outcomes. And when you place the success of a decision, or the definition of whether a decision is good or bad, on the perfect outcome, then it becomes uncontrollable, right? Because there's going to be external factors that influence an outcome. And rarely are high achievers or any of us really focused on a decision being good based on the process that we're going through to actually make a decision. In addition to the bar itself that high achievers are holding themselves to and holding their decisions to being very high, the other challenge is that the bar itself keeps moving, because high achievers are surrounded by other high achievers. I even talk about this in celebrating wins, right? Like in terms of being content with who you are, the decisions that you've made, the life that you're living if you're constantly comparing yourself to others, if you're not pausing to celebrate the progress that you've had, if once you've achieved something, but then that achievement becomes normalized because you're surrounded by other high achievers who have done the
Yeah.
same thing. For example, if you go to an Ivy League school, the achievement feels less impressive when your friend group are all fellow Ivy Leaguers,
Right.
or same for a prestigious company that you might be working for. And so the challenge being that that goalpost keeps moving, and that pursuit of an aligned life becomes harder because we're not necessarily pausing long enough to be introspective, to reflect on whether the path we're on is one we still actually want to be on versus a rat race that we're on because everyone else is on it. And so it's this combination of getting trapped in analysis paralysis because we're looking for this answer, and then also, constantly comparing to other outcomes that could be based on what we're seeing from the success of others, perhaps creates this like comparative counterfactual that can breed regret, even
Sure.
though it might not necessarily be fair.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough cohort to be in, especially if one is competitive because everybody is so successful. And you're right about the idea of comparing. Comparing obviously goes on, and it can be very destructive if you're comparing yourself to other people and then measuring your success against them and then seeing how you could have done something better or should have been better. So that makes a lot of sense, Parul. I get that. Let's go back a little bit to something you had just mentioned briefly, and you talk about it quite a bit in your book. And this idea of the personal North Star, which I thought was kind of an interesting reference point for decision-making process in this model that you're talking about. Tell us a bit more about that.
When I think about the goal of decision making and it being to minimize regret and maximize peace of mind, implicit in that is the importance of knowing what it is that you want, knowing what it is that you value, knowing what it is that you're aspiring for. And so that can happen in at two levels. One is just at the situational level, right? Like in this decision that I'm making, what is it that is important to me? But there's also that meta life level of what is it that I'm working towards, or what's that guiding light. And so it felt important to incorporate a phase around defining your North Star in this path of least regret process, so that someone is pausing long enough to think about what is it that's driving them, what could be a driver of potential regret for them, and having that clarity in place before making a choice or decision that might be narrower in scope. Like maybe it's specific to a career choice, or it's specific to a relationship, or it's even as mundane as, do I go to this party or do I not? But for those decisions that matter most in our life, having that lens of what your North Star is an important guiding light.
Yeah, you brought up the Japanese concept of ikigai and values and purpose. Does that tie into the North Star, the personal North Star?
In the chapter on a personal North Star, I share that some people define their North Star with I am statements, and phrases that embody this vision that they have for their life. But the challenge with that is it doesn't necessarily provide you a blueprint for how to then effectuate that North Star and put it into action. And so I wanted to incorporate the Japanese framework of Ikigai into this chapter on North Star, because when it comes to integrating our personal life and our professional life, which is what most of our working hours go towards, it felt like a way to define what a North Star could be while also giving us clarity on how to achieve it. Because Ikigai is the intersection of four things: what we're good at, what we love to do, what the world needs. And traditionally, it's what you can be paid for. In the book, I redefine it to be what can sustain us. But if we are clear on these four lenses, like what is it that we love? What is it that the world needs that we want to be able to impact? Those are questions that can help us define our North Star. But when we think of our goal as being intersecting all four of these quadrants together, then it gives us a sense of how can we actually make decisions in our personal and professional life to work towards something that can actually intersect these together.
A few points in the book, you talk about this concept of certainty and clarity. And you make the point that certainty is not always possible, but clarity is. Let's talk about the distinction between those things and how they relate to what we're talking about.
How I've thought about certainty and clarity in this book is related to decision making and whether it is focused on outcome versus process. So when I'm thinking about certainty, it's when we're making a decision hoping for a certain outcome on the other side. And that will define a decision as being good if it results in the outcome that we expected and wanted. Whereas clarity is more of a process that we can go through. It is an unpacking of what it is that we're solving for, what is it that we can know, what are the questions that we can ask, what are the trade-offs that we can consider. And it's a process that can lead us to a decision that is most aligned at that time. It's the one that we feel, based on what we know in that moment, feels most right to us. But there's no certainty that on the other side of it, it's going to actually lead to what we want.
Right, that makes sense. So I'm going to throw you a hard one here because I know this is the type of thing where there's no right answer. But people face situations all the time where they have to make hard choices. And like you said, there's no certainty of how any choice is going to turn out. And I'm hearing that you want to approach it more with a sense of clarity, that the process that you're going through is aligned with your values and where you're going, and without knowing that the certainty is there. So let's imagine somebody is faced with a few different options, an option A and an option B, and they're both tough options, and they're trying to weigh through all of the factors that might make option A the better choice, but there's some drawbacks, and the same with option B. And let's say they're taking into consideration all sorts of things, their family, their partners, their children, their work obligations, money, all of this stuff. Where would you take this person in terms of trying to think through option A, say, versus option B? And if there's anything else in the mix that they could consider.
Yeah. I think our tendency is to start with looking at the options and then comparing the pros and cons of option A versus option B. And that's the process I had first started on when I was also choosing my treatment plan. I was looking at the option A that was, both option A and option B that were being presented to be my oncologist, and struggling with determining which one to pursue, because as you're implying, there are drawbacks and benefits to each one.
Yep.
And when I asked myself, what is my path of least regret? What that freed me to do is not be restricted by just looking at option A and looking at option B, but to start off with actually defining what is it that I'm solving for. And what I realized, taking this diagnosis and treatment plan option for the moment, is that I wasn't just solving for lifespan, right? Because if I was, then I would follow the data. But when I clarified for myself that there's a reason that I was hesitant to just take option A and take the more aggressive option, it was because what I realized about myself is I was also trying to solve for health span, that I was trying to not have to take on unnecessary toxicity that could potentially have longer term side effects, even though the data that exists, the longitudinal studies that exist, point to that being the best for lifespan. And once I clarified for myself what I'm actually solving for, it allowed me to have conversations with my doctors where I expressed those concerns. And we actually ended up creating an option C. The treatment plan that I actually ended up pursuing was a third option that they hadn't even presented to me before, because that was the one that was more mitigating my concerns around unnecessary toxicity, while also being aggressive enough that I wouldn't feel concerned that, oh, I should have just done something more aggressive. There was no guarantee that the cancer wasn't going to come back or that like recurrence was fully eliminated, but there was peace of mind in knowing that I had not felt restricted by just one or two options, but by starting with what it is I was trying to solve for, that I was ultimately choosing a new path that best fits that. And so bringing it back to the conversation of when we're stuck between two hard choices, I would say two things here. One is to not consider your first step to be, okay, what is option A and what is option B, but start by defining what is it that I'm aspiring towards, right? What is that version of myself that I am solving for? And then from there, working backwards, does option A or option B meet that? Or is there a new option that can be crafted, a new career path, a new business model that can be constructed that's actually going to mitigate the hesitations and concerns that I have? The second part of this, though, is recognizing that there's a reason the book is not called The Path of No Regret. And the reality is that there are hard choices, there are trade-offs, there are what ifs that are going to remain on the other side because of this exact point that we can't control the outcome. And we might get the outcome that we want, but what we actually care about has changed by that point, that we might wonder, what if we had done something different? Or we might have made the best decision that we could and still not have had the outcome that we want. And so there could be some regret that lives on the other side, but the goal is to minimize it. And we can best minimize it if we know that we've clarified for ourselves what our North Star is, what it is that we're solving for, and we pursued a path that is best in service of that. Because when those moments of regret or what if do arise, we have that ability to reassure ourselves that we made the best decision that we could at the time.
Yeah, well, that gets back to the hindsight bias kind of issue that what you're saying is you make the decisions you can at the time, the best you're able to with the information you have available to you, using your personal North Star as the compass for how you're making that decision. But then there's no certainty on how that will turn out. And so down the road, the best you can do at that point is to say, I made this decision the best one I could at the time, even if it didn't go exactly the way that I had hoped that it would, or even if I'm saying now, maybe the other option would have been a better option. I didn't know it at the time that I made the decision. I made the decision with the best set of information I had and using my compass as a guide for the decision I was making. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
This is also where it becomes important to intervene for ourselves what counterfactual thinking might lead us down, right? Because as you know, more than the rest of us, we have a negativity bias. We have this tendency to, in general, think about all the things that could go wrong. But when we are on the other side of a decision and thinking about what a different path could have looked like, we tend to think about how it could have been better.
Right.
And when we fall into that comparative counterfactual thinking, we're like creating an environment ripe with regret because we're imagining all of these scenarios where if we had chosen differently, all these better things would have actually occurred. And if we recognize our tendency to do that and pause to ask ourselves, well, how could it have actually gone worse? what could have actually gone, poorly had I made these other decisions. Then we allow ourselves a more honest assessment of the possibilities that could have existed. And as we think about, reassuring ourselves that we made a good decision or the best one that we could, it's recognizing that things actually could have been worse in an alternate scenario, and it's not just rosy options on the other side.
Yeah, totally. And I'll give you a very extreme example of that. I remember I had a patient once who was just a fitness fanatic, and she was like the healthiest person you could possibly imagine. She ate really healthy diet and exercise and just really took great care of herself. And then in her 70s, she got colon cancer. And, she was then beating up on herself, what did I do wrong? And how could I have eaten a better diet or done better? Or maybe I just shouldn't have done any of this, because if I was going to get colon cancer anyway, why did I even bother spending 70 years trying to be healthy? So she was even going back saying like this was all pointless. And then we had to point out exactly what you were talking about. Yeah, you did end up with colon cancer, but could you have gotten this a lot worse when you were younger if you weren't taking as good care of yourself as you did? Did you manage the treatment as well as you did because you were so healthy? And that would have been different if you were less healthy. So many things that she wasn't thinking about, only that she got colon cancer despite the fact that she had tried taking good care of herself. So you're exactly right. You can go back and tell yourself, I now in hindsight, I regret having made this decision. I should have done something else, but you have no idea what the other outcome would have been. And that's what you're saying. And I agree completely with that.
Absolutely. I am reminded of the phase that we were talking about around overcoming mental roadblocks. And such an important part of that phase is really recognizing what is the narrative that's in our head and how well is it serving us. And so, I experienced that narrative myself when I was diagnosed because I was 31. I was in good shape. I had been dancing. I vegetarian, all these healthy life choices, don't smoke, don't drink, all of the things. And had people tell me that exact comment of like, doesn't it seem so unfair that this happened to you? And it's so easy to fall into that trap of self-pity, of anger, of guilt, whatever it might be. But I felt in that moment that thinking about it that way wasn't serving me. And what I wanted to do is change that narrative and being able to think about it differently and say, well, if I think about the diagnosis as inevitable, then how lucky am I that I've taken care of my health, that I've eaten well, and that my body is as strong as it could be or is, stronger than it otherwise would have been to be able to actually handle treatment and, face this diagnosis.
Yeah, that's a much more positive narrative. And we just know that there's such a strong mind body connection that remaining positive and optimistic, I have to think, is just a much better road to go down than to go into the spiral of regret and beating up on yourself and just feeling more depressed. I mean, obviously, it's a hard situation to go through. I can't imagine many people with cancer are going to be just dancing and happy. But there's also ways in which one can shape their narrative to remain sort of positive and optimistic. And so, yeah, I think that's a perfect example of that. And thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely. Actually, the author of my foreword is Dr. Aaliyah Crum from Stanford, who does a lot of work on this connection between mind and body. She's actually the director of the Stanford Mind and Body Lab and researches how our mindset and our beliefs impact our physical reality. And one study that she and her team did was actually specifically with cancer patients, newly diagnosed cancer patients. And I was one of several patients who were interviewed about the mindsets that we had that had helped us during our treatment journey. And what her study found, and these videos were then shared with certain patients to try to intervene on their mindsets, and then some were not shown these videos. And what her research found is that mindset made a measurable difference in both psychological and physiological outcomes for these patients, and that there was a big difference between the mindset of cancer is a catastrophe and like the worst thing that could happen to me versus cancer is manageable. And it's not that I'm viewing it as a blessing and this, great thing that happened, but it's viewing it as something that I am capable of facing and that my body is capable of managing and recovering from. And that difference in mindset and belief in one's framing of the situation does in fact change our physical reality.
So I assume she looked at some outcome measures of some sort.
Yeah, there are studies with those outcomes
Yeah.
listed in terms of physical outcomes in response to side effects, as well as clinical outcomes, as well as self-reported measures of depression and whatnot.
Yeah. Well, that's a really fascinating study, and the results really make a lot of sense and I think are very important. So that's a good illustration of that for sure. I want to ask you about one other related topic to the decision making, and this has to do with changing course. And you talk about this idea of changing course, making detours in a decision making process, and how that can sometimes be difficult for people and feel like if I realize that the decision I made was not the right decision or there was something wrong with it and I need to change course here, that I blew it somehow and there's something wrong with me, and I people can beat up on themselves for realizing that they made the wrong choice and now have to change. Can you shed some light on that concept and what might be more a helpful way of looking at it?
Yeah, the fifth phase is adaptation and really focused on allowing for detours. And I would frame it a bit differently than how you just described it. I don't necessarily think of it as you reach a point where you feel like you made the wrong decision and regret that other decision and now are going to like try to correct for that and make a new decision. It's more about recognizing that we can make choices that lead us on our path of least regret, but as we evolve and continue to become, what our path of least regret looks like might also be evolving. And it's recognizing that this journey of awareness and processing and exploration and decision that we're going through is actually not linear. It's cyclical because, once we choose the career or we, launch the business or whatever it is that is some version of our path of least regret in that moment, we might enter a new stage where that becomes inertia, or there's some new acute curveball that throws us off course, and we end up going through this cycle all over again. And so adaptation phase is more about recognizing how have we changed, and are the choices that we once made still aligned to who we are now? Or is there a new sense of discontent in our life that feels like a change needs to be created? And it's allowing ourselves the permission to make a detour without viewing it as failure. Because it's not that those past decisions were bad decisions necessarily, they were the right decisions for that time. And now in this new season of life, a new decision, a new path might be what's best.
Do you think somebody's personal North Star can change and sort of the values can change and
Corporate North Stars are more likely to change.
uh-huh.
Personal North Stars are, I wouldn't say unchanging, but they're a bit more deeply rooted.
Mm-hmm.
I think how well we're willing to serve that North Star changes over time, though. It could be that we say our North Star is to invest in our relationships and be surrounded with people that we love. But in our 20s and 30s, we might actually make decisions that are favoring our career and just working hard that aren't necessarily in service of that North Star, but it feels like what we need to do at the time. Whereas as we get older, we might actually make professional decisions differently that are more in alignment of that North Star, not because the value changed, but because our willingness and potentially our ability to focus and serve that value has shifted.
And I imagine that a big part of it is just figuring out what that personal North Star is, because
Absolutely.
for many people, they may not even really know that and may be making decisions, not even really realizing or paying attention to what are the real motivations for why I'm making these decisions in the first place and what's really important to me. So that in and of itself seems like it might be important to the process.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is where the traditional understanding of regret as a backward looking burden can actually be very helpful, because going through the exercise of reflecting on your past and reflecting on decisions that you do actually regret or situations that you do actually carry some regret for can help shed light on what your values are, what your priorities are, what your North Star could be, or is, as you make decisions going forward.
Okay. So let's say somebody's listening to this podcast episode right now and they're in the middle of a real messy situation and they're afraid of choosing the wrong thing. What would you tell them?
I would ask them to define what is it that they're ultimately solving for in the context of this situation, to have that clarity of what they're optimizing for, recognizing that when it comes to making hard choices, there isn't going to be a perfect option that gives them everything that they want and avoids everything that they don't want. And so it's really a question of weighing the trade off and finding comfort and peace in knowing what trade offs you made and why, so that you can then always also reassure yourself down the road of that, when you do wonder what if, being able to remind yourself that, like, I knew this was a risk, or I knew this was a trade off. And at the time I made the decision, I was willing to make it.
Parul, this has been a very interesting conversation so far, and I've really enjoyed hearing your thoughts about the path of least regret. And obviously, you really are passionate about this subject, I'm sure, coming from your personal experiences and then having reflected upon what you've gone through and then trying to help other people think through the situations that they're in and trying to have a better approach to how they're looking at making decisions in their life. Is there anything that you'd like to leave us with?
As we spoke about the path of least regret, we were defining it as these 5 phases that you move through. And that is the framework that is shared in the book. And yet the takeaway is that the path of least regret is as much of a mindset or philosophy as it is this multi-step framework. It's really about approaching life with this level of resilience and intentionality and agency, that you are making choices based on what you value and what is going to give you peace of mind. And whether you're going through each phase step by step or skipping all these phases altogether, it's really just one question that you can ask yourself in the smallest and biggest of choices.
So, Parul, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure having you here. And I'm just wondering if people are interested. I assume The Path of Least Regret is probably available on Amazon.com and all the places you buy books and all of that. But tell us a little bit more about if people want to learn more about you and find out more about your journey and the work that you do.
Oh, thank you for asking. I love writing and speaking about all of these things related to navigating uncertainty, navigating change, making hard choices, and work with companies and conferences, keynote speaker, leading workshops on these topics. And if anyone wants to dive deeper into it, they can learn more about me on my website at parulsomani.com and join my mailing list for more updates and tips and insights on these topics. They can follow me on social media on LinkedIn and Instagram at PD Somani. And the book, as you mentioned, The Path of Least Regret, is available at all online retailers, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, bookshop.org, and wherever you buy your books online.
Great. Well, wonderful. So I recommend that listeners who are interested in Parul and her work go to check those out. And it's been a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you for all of your wonderful and wise insights.
Thank you for the great conversation.
Thank you for listening to MindTricks Radio. I hope you have enjoyed the program. For more information about MindTricks, you can go to my website, www.waikikihealth.com. Be sure to subscribe to MindTricks on your preferred podcasting host to be notified of new episodes of MindTricks. Please take some time to give MindTricks a good rating and review wherever you are listening. It really helps get the word out to new listeners. And please like and share MindTricks posts on Twitter and Facebook by following your host, Dr. Aaron Kaplan.